Tonight, KCRA 3 investigates millions of taxpayer dollars spent with little accountability. We're looking into the Sacramento City Council and how they spend their discretionary money.
It seems that there's an absence of any guidelines or structure.
A new mix of city council members is taking the helm at Sacramento City Hall. They're responsible for budgeting millions of tax dollars from everything for parks to police.
But they have their own pot of money for pet projects big and small. And tonight, in a KCRA 3 investigation, Kevin Oliver shows us how city leaders are spending your tax dollars and who spends the most.
$16 million. That's what city leaders have to spend with little oversight. Critics have concerns about how they're spending some of that money, but our investigation found it's all legal. Porta potties and movie nights, bounce houses and face painters. These are just a few of the items Sacramento City Council members have spent thousands of tax dollars on in the past year.
I do solemnly swear.
When they're sworn in, each city council member gets their own budget of nearly $400,000 a year, or $1.6 million over their 4-year term. The mayor gets even more, $940,000 a year. If you do the math, for one term, that's $16.5 million for the council and the mayor to spend with few restrictions. Sacramento State Professor Charles Gossett says it's unusual for city council members to have that much money at their individual discretion.
I think it raises the problem of accountability, and it's not to say that people are not currently using it responsibly, but it seems that there's an absence of any guidelines or structure.
The mayor and city council members have to pay their own set salaries and costs for any staff they hire out of their accounts. But the remainder is up to them on how they spend it or carry it over to the next year.
Whenever you move substantial amounts of money outside that normal budget process, it's inviting abuse.
John Capal of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association says there isn't much oversight over these discretionary accounts.
We're not talking about a few $100s to buy office supplies, those kinds of things. This is fairly substantial amounts of money. And I think one of the concerns that we have is that these discretionary funds become incumbent protection funds.
Last year, the mayor spent $905,000. That includes his own salary of $117,000 and more than $700,000 spent on the mayor's personal staff and their benefits. Johnson spent $84,000 on hundreds of other items, including an $11,000 staff appreciation luncheon, trips to Washington, D.C., and a brochure listing his accomplishments. The council members spent anywhere from $311,000 to $432,000 this past year. On average, they spent about 80% of their funds on their personal staff. How much was spent on other items varies. Angelique Ashby spent nearly $36,000, while Councilmember Alan Warren spent $111,000.
That's a very large discretionary amount for them to have.
Gossett says Sacramento is one of only a few cities which gives council members the latitude to spend that much discretionary money. He says most cities have a budget specifically for council staffing and operations.
That's their choice, how they want to design their office. And then there's a small remaining amount.
Fresno, Oakland, and Long Beach, all similar in size to Sacramento, have budgets set aside for council members and operations with smaller amounts for discretionary spending. Fresno gives its council members $50,000 a year. We reached out to all 8 council members to ask them how they spent their money.
That budget is what we use to pay the people who answer the phones, answer the emails, and are here on a regular basis to deal with the issues of our particular district. It's also the funding that we use to provide things like movie night in the park, or supporting a Little League team, or donating bikes for a good cause.
A city auditor back in 2004 recommended establishing written policies, written procedures, and the establishment of clear practices for how those funds could be used. But in 10 years, the city clerk's office says no new rules or policies have been put in place.
The reality is the normal budget process has restrictions in it, provides for oversight and review.
Ashby says their expenditures face audits and reviews like other city departments.
Coming from the elected council member's office, there is a higher level of scrutiny and oversight than if it were in another department as evidenced by the fact that I'm standing in front of you answering to those funds right now.
Most of the money does appear to go to community events within their districts, but not all of the money. We found council members gave tax money to organizations including business groups, labor organizations, and even Planned Parenthood without a council-wide vote, which might raise questions for some taxpayers. When we asked Councilmember Ashby about her donation to Planned Parenthood, this is what happened.
So I hope that in doing so, that some of those young women grow up, love their city enough to come back, run for city council, and be the next mayor pro tem of the city of Sacramento. Here you go.
All of these contributions are made without a public vote. Again, nothing we found was illegal, but some are questioning some of those expenses. Tomorrow night, we'll tell you how much money city council members have given to Planned Parenthood and how some taxpayers feel about it.
Tonight, KCRA 3 investigates taxpayer money getting donated to organizations like Planned Parenthood.
I don't think they, as elected officials, should have the ability just to spend where they please.
KCRA 3 has learned millions of dollars in discretionary spending by the Sacramento City Council has now caught the attention of the Sacramento County Grand Jury.
They're now starting a formal inquiry into the spending. In light of our investigation, tonight KCRA 3's Kevin Oliver examines which organizations are getting taxpayer money.
City Council member Angelique Ashby is among the most fiscally conservative of her colleagues when it comes to her discretionary funds. Compared to other City Council members, last year Ashby spent the least, about $35,000 on community service programs and local events. But that included giving tax dollars to Planned Parenthood. When we asked about that donation, it led to this.
I donated to a scholarship fund. The money that I gave only could go to a scholarship fund for young single moms already selected to go to college. At one point in my life, sir, that was me. So I hope that in doing so, that some of those young women grow up, love their city enough to come back, run for city council, and be the next mayor pro tem of the city of Sacramento. Here you go.
But Ashby isn't alone. In the last 2 years, every city council member gave some of their discretionary funds to Planned Parenthood, a total of $11,000.
I don't think they, as elected officials, should have the ability just to spend where they please.
Sacramento resident and mother of four, Christina Marotti, says she doesn't want her tax dollars going to Planned Parenthood programs, period.
It almost seems like it's kind of hidden. If it's not voted on, if it's not announced, I mean, you found it, but I never knew about it before that.
Most of the money went to a scholarship fund and a program that provided support groups for teenage mothers. Planned Parenthood says the Teen Success Program costs $50,000 a year to help 12 single mothers. A spokesperson for the organization was not available to comment on camera, but said, quote, "We get a great deal of funding from tax dollars. Education reduces a lot of taxpayer costs." But the money was never voted on, which Marotti also takes issue with.
I think if people were aware of it, you would have an overwhelming amount of people showing up at a city council meeting complaining. I think you would have calls to their offices. I think you would have long lines if there was an open forum for people to discuss. I think it would be a big issue.
But Councilmember Steve Cohn defended using City Council discretionary funds for the programs. In an email, Cohn said, "I believe that it is an undeniably worthy community purpose. These funds do not go to abortions or other controversial programming." Planned Parenthood officials says it is their policy to keep funding for educational programs separate from other services.
It invites concern.
Sacramento State Professor Charles Gossett says City Council members aren't going to be able to make everyone happy when deciding how to spend tax dollars.
That's always a problem in a democracy. Sometimes the city will purchase things from a vendor that some people don't think you should be buying from that vendor, but it may have been the best offer.
But Gossett says there are ways to alleviate concerns about giving tax money to organizations that some might find controversial by establishing clear policies or even citizen commissions to make those decisions.
That's why I think it's better to have rules up front that are debated publicly, and then you're just applying the rules, to the individual case.
Two groups, Ion Sacramento and the League of Women Voters, are trying to get the city to enact several reform measures, including an ethics code and citizen commission, as well as new sunshine laws to improve transparency in city government. Kevin Oliver, KCRA 3 News.
And Planned Parenthood isn't the only organization that receives thousands of dollars from City Council discretionary funds. Tomorrow night on our News at 10, we'll look at other groups who not only got tax money from council members, but also contributed to council members' campaigns.
A KCRA 3 investigation into the Sacramento City Council's use of their discretionary funds has now led to an inquiry by the county grand jury.
Under the current system, each council member gets $400,000 a year to spend at their discretion with little oversight. Well, now 48 hours after our first report, the grand jury plans to look into the process of how those funds are spent.
And that brings us to part 3 of our investigation. Tonight, KCRA 3's investigative reporter Kevin Oliver shows us what some council members have been getting from groups they've been giving to.
It was a simple invitation to celebrate retiring Sacramento police officers, and council members took up the offer, spending $3,000 to buy 2 tables at the event. Councilmember Angela Gashby insisted there was nothing unusual about it.
It's not money that goes to some person retiring. It's money that goes to an event to honor officers that are retiring from our system.
But the tickets did spark a debate within City Hall over whether it was appropriate, in part because the organization holding the dinner was the Sacramento Police Officers Association, the same labor group which represents police in contract talks with the city. The association has also made campaign contributions to many city council members. One internal email noted the finance director told department heads not to use city funds to pay for their tickets and, quote, most certainly no credit cards. But the city clerk noted, while it may not be best practices for members to do so, it is not illegal. The head of the Police Officers Association says the money went solely to the cost of the retirement dinner and plaques.
It's not a moneymaker or a fundraiser. We really we spend probably even above and beyond all the sponsorships we get, $15,000 or so on that dinner.
But taxpayer groups say it still raises questions.
You know, the fact that you've got a city council member giving some of their discretionary funds to that labor organization, I think that just doesn't look right.
John Capal of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association says discretionary funds are often used to curry favor among groups that can bring them votes later.
The biggest concern is that they are an invitation to be used to protect incumbency. And I think that's the biggest concern we have about these discretionary funds.
The Police Officers Association isn't the only organization to get council money and give campaign contributions to candidates. We found several business groups that were also given city council discretionary funds and at some point made campaign contributions. For instance, the Metro Chamber has contributed to campaigns for Steve Cohn, Angela Gashby, Steve Hansen, and Bonnie Pinnell, and all 4 used their taxpayer-funded discretionary accounts to give back to the chamber this past year. Vice Mayor Jay Chenier was given a $500 campaign contribution in 2010 from the Hispanic Chamber. 3 years later, he spent $500 from his city account as a donation to the Chamber's golf tournament. While the city attorney's office says it's legal, Sacramento State Professor of Government Charles Gossett points out the need for clear policies on how council members' discretionary funds are used.
And it's typically not going to be an exact equivalency in the amount, but the principle is still the same, is should you be allowed to give money to organizations that are allowed to give money back to you? And that's where I think it's important to have guidelines written that spell out exactly whether that's approved or whether it's not approved and how you should handle it.
In an email, outgoing council member Steve Cohn defended maintaining individual discretionary accounts, saying it's a way to make sure their district's needs are met. But Cohn is also advocating for both a city ethics commission and a sunshine law to provide transparency and more oversight.
And we talked with both the Fair Political Practices Commission and the City Attorney's Office, and both said as long as all of this money changing hands is documented and reported, it's all legal. So basically nothing in our investigation because of that has found that any laws have been broken. But a lot of questions have been raised by all of this.
Absolutely, and it's good to just, like you said, just kind of flip through things and see where the money's going. Talk a little bit about the grand jury and when they're going to be investigating this.
Well, at this point, it's just a grand jury inquiry, so it's the first step. It's a secret process, so there's limited information, but we will have more on that tonight at 10.
And Kevin, it's certainly controversial. What are we hearing from council members?
We have contacted all the city council members, the city attorney's office, the city clerk's office, and the mayor's office. So far, no response from them today at all on this new grand jury inquiry.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Great report. A KCRA 3 investigation into the Sacramento City Council's use of their discretionary funds has now sparked an inquiry by the county grand jury. In our first report, we revealed how each council member gets hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend at their sole discretion.
KCRA 3's Kevin Oliver explains why the grand jury wants to look at what's going on at City Hall as KCRA 3 investigates.
Sources close to the county grand jury say they want to know more about how the city council has been using its discretionary funds. Our first report earlier this week outlining the amount of money city council members get initially caught jurors' attention. Each council member gets their own budget of nearly $400,000 a year, or $1.6 million over their 4-year term, to spend almost however they want. The mayor gets even more, $940,000 a year.
We're not talking about a few $100s to buy office supplies, those kinds of things. This is fairly substantial amounts of money.
The grand jury is likely to look at how that money is spent and who approves it. We found most of the money is spent on staff, but what they don't use for personnel can be spent with few restrictions, and that's where some are raising concerns. For example, we found council members use their discretionary accounts to fund programs at Planned Parenthood, which doesn't sit well with some residents.
It almost seems like it's kind of hidden. If it's not voted on, if it's not announced, I mean, you found it, but I never knew about it before that.
City Council member Angelique Ashby defended her use of tax dollars for the Planned Parenthood programs.
So I hope that in doing so, that some of those young women grow up, love their city enough to come back, run for city council, and be the next mayor pro tem of the city of Sacramento.
Even before we began asking questions, there was already an internal debate at City Hall over how other expenditures have been made, like whether city funds should be spent on a police retirement dinner held by the Sacramento Police Officers Association. That's a labor union that not only represents police in contract talks, but also has donated to council members' campaigns.
It's not money that goes to some person retiring. It's money that goes to an event to honor officers that are retiring from our system.
But one internal email noted the finance director told department heads not to use city funds to pay for their tickets and, quote, most certainly no credit cards. Ultimately, the city clerk noted, quote, while it may not be best practices for members to do so, it is not illegal. The head of the Police Officers Association says the money went solely to the cost of the retirement dinner and plaques.
It's not a moneymaker or a fundraiser. We really actually, we spend probably even above and beyond all the sponsorships we get, $15,000 or so on that dinner.
We talked with both the Fair Political Practices Commission and the City Attorney's Office, and both said as long as all this money changing hands is documented and reported, it's legal. And nothing in our investigation has found any laws have been broken. But even if no laws have been broken, the grand jury could look at the process and make recommendations.
Sacramento State Professor Charles Gossett says establishing clear policies is one way to alleviate concerns.
It invites concern because there aren't really guidelines that the city council member can turn and say, I followed the guidelines that were given, as opposed to saying, it's my money to do with as I deem appropriate.
Kevin Oliver, KCRA 3 News.
And Kevin says there have been calls from civic groups in the past to put city council expenditures on the internet for everyone to see, but so far that hasn't happened.